I feel privileged to open this event and stand here where many accomplished men and women who I admired and looked up to once stood. Our speaker, Mr. Christopher Bowden. His career has seen him make a substantial contribution to saving 4 bird species from the brink of global extinction. Chris began his career in the early 1980s as a research biologist for the RSPB, investigating the reasons for the decline of some of the United Kingdom's most threatened bird species, including nightjar, woodlark, and stone curlew. For the last 18 years, he has led RSPB efforts to save 3 species of vulture in Asia.
Okay, is this working? No. Any better? A little bit better. Okay, can you all hear me clearly? Yes. Thank you very much, and thank you indeed everyone for coming. I'm sorry we are starting a little late. It's a special pleasure to be here. I'm Chris Bowden. I work for the RSPB, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, and as you've kindly introduced, I do my best to coordinate the consortium Saving Asia's Vultures from Extinction. And I'm going to be doing a double act today with my colleague John Mallord, who will be covering some of the scientific backbone to some of the generalizations that I will be presenting. So I hope most people here are fairly familiar with what's really one of the biggest conservation stories in the last 3 decades, for certainly in bird conservation terms, and it's been an honor to try and play a part in responding to that. And I'm going to explain very, very briefly some of the background to the main threats to vultures, and then about the ways in which we've done our best to respond to that, and then John will explain more on the scientific background to that story. Okay, so I think we all know that vultures have declined absolutely catastrophically, and this species in particular, the white-rumped vulture, has been subject to the worst declines of all, populations halving each year for probably 10 years in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So that graph doesn't look such a dramatic one until you realize that it's plotted on a logarithmic scale. And those trajectories are absolutely ones towards total extinction, if allowed to happen. So, and particularly for white-rumped vulture. And so the response to that has been quite significant and quite positive. But just before we go to the response, the role of vultures in the environment, particularly here in India, has been enormous. There were such large numbers. It's very difficult to estimate exactly how many birds there were, but certainly in the tens of millions. And the effect of losing so many scavenging birds has had a knock-on effect with feral dog populations, and we have good information that feral dogs increased by at least 30% in a similar time period, and of course are the main vector of rabies. And 7,000 to 8,000 cases of rabies in India every year, even now. So there's very real human health impact of losing the vultures indirectly through increasing feral dog numbers. And that's something which I think, because it's a very indirect effect, doesn't get enough attention. But I hope everybody here is It's was quite an unexpected effect of a veterinary drug, diclofenac, but we'll come on to hear more about other drugs which are also a concern. But those declines were caused by veterinary drug diclofenac used in cattle, the primary food source of these vultures, particularly in the cow belt in North India, and the diclofenac, or in those tissues of cattle, once the vulture consumes it within 2 to 3 days after death, the vultures die of kidney failure. But very subtle, and understanding the science of that is crucial. So it actually was quite a challenge to convince even the conservation community that this really was the main problem. Vultures have also had, still do have, such important cultural significance here in India, and I think everybody's familiar with the story of Jatayu, but also for the Parsi communities. The sky burials, and indeed in the Himalaya, sky burials also important, but everyday removal of those carcasses, cattle carcasses, was probably the biggest, not just cultural, but practical utility of vultures. But the Indian government responded extremely positively to this. And I think it is great credit to the Indian government that the Secretary of Environment took it very seriously. He took the science seriously and pushed forward for the veterinary diclofenac ban in 2006. And I do firmly believe that that ban is what has prevented vultures from going totally extinct across the subcontinent, because not only India, but Nepal and Pakistan immediately followed India's lead on this, and diclofenac usage in veterinary practice has reduced very, very significantly, but not quite to zero, unfortunately. We'll be hearing a bit more about that. You can see other countries are following India's example there, and we are still faced with the challenge of these bans being extended globally, because we know that there is, but it is a very subtle effect, but we are very confident that this is a problem much more widely than just South Asia. So that's a challenge, but it's publications and scientific work which has been key to achieving that ban. And as anyone who's heard me speak before, I always refer to this as my favorite slide, because it summarizes crucial information about the different drugs. You can see diclofenac listed at the bottom there, and I've mentioned that diclofenac was the main driver of the declines, but unfortunately other drugs have come in to replace diclofenac, some of which are safe and some of which are also toxic. John will be telling us a bit more about the scientific backing to this slide. But if there's one slide that I want you to pay full attention to today, it's this slide. And, but you will see listed in yellow at the bottom, there are a number of other compounds which are also, or drugs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, which have never been tested for their safety. And so we have a big challenge of knowing what to do about those drugs. Another gross simplification that I just want to put to you, and this is from the Multi-Species Action Plan developed in 2017, but it's still absolutely the case now, is the threat map to vultures across Asia. And you will see that there are differences in which threat is most predominant. Here in South Asia, it is NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, including diclofenac. But there are different threats. Poison baits is a predominant threat, actually, through much of Europe and Africa, and indeed in Southeast Asia, along with other problems of declining food availability. But in South Asia, including India, NSAIDs remain the #1 threat. And again, this is backed up by things that John will tell you. So I'm just telling you these facts as facts, and but why would you believe me? I mean, and I have some science background, but I'm not the scientist at the forefront of this body of work, and we realized that even though we had made a lot of progress working on this together with the Bombay Natural History Society, the IVRI, the Indian Veterinary Research Institute here in India, but we needed that message to be owned and agreed right across Asia, not just between a small number of organizations. And so we came up with the idea to try and create a more inclusive consortium of organizations that were following the real priorities of vulture conservation backed by that science. And we needed a clear plan, and we needed to communicate that. So that was the justification for creating this consortium, which we've named SAVE, Saving Asia's Vultures from Extinction, and the 6 countries where the 4 critically endangered vulture species, the top 4 there in that image, where their range maps. So India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Myanmar and Cambodia. So we needed to get a response in all of these countries and to have something inclusive that would involve them all, even though we kind of knew all the real answers and all the main action needs to come here in India. And it's not a coincidence that I've been based in India for the last 11 years and working on this for 20 years now, because India is central to the ultimate conservation of these species. So here is the array of organizations which have already signed up to the consortium. We started with 11 and then 14 organizations back in 2011. We've already grown to 34, but we're hoping that that will expand further. But these organizations are not just here because they like vultures and because they care about what happens to vultures. They are there because they are actively implementing top priority actions which have been agreed by the consortium. And we launched the consortium in Delhi with Jarem Ramesh, who helped us do that, but we also have some of the best raptor biologists from all over the world have agreed to chair on a rotational basis, and Professor Ian Newton was a particularly prominent one who started us off back in 2011. And we have annual meetings We have committees with the technical committee, with representation from all over the world. There is significant external input from people like John and from outside Asia, but you'll see the names in these committees are very much representation and scientists and advocacy leads from within each of the 6 range countries. We tend to meet annually. We form a vulture recovery plan we call the Blueprint for Recovery, a regional plan, and discuss updates against the plan. And there we've got the priority actions which have been listed by SAVE as the key ones. And sometimes it's important to acknowledge which are the absolute priority things and which are less priority and could be a distraction from really removing that primary threat. I'll let you read those rather than reading them out. I just wanted to illustrate that from our meetings, and we actually had an online open day meeting just 3-4 weeks ago, which perhaps some of you attended, but even if you didn't, you could catch up on it. And we get trends and updates on what's happening to vultures right across the region. There's from 4 of the range countries, the trends from properly replicable and systematic survey data. And you will see that despite the fact that we are pleased with some of the progress, the trends of population in 3 of those countries listed there are still negative trends. So we are not, we've not succeeded yet. But the bottom right from Nepal is the shining example of hope, where we have got some reversal of the negative trends. I'll let you tell a bit more about that, shall I, John? Okay. One other feature of the consortium that has been very constructive is coming up with different ideas and sharing ideas for that really work. And vulture safe zones, you can see some of the activities of vulture safe zones listed there. And indeed, we've got a new initiative here in Tamil Nadu, led by Arulagam, to establish a vulture safe zone centered on Mudamalai. But these are huge areas, though, so there's a huge amount to do. And if any of you want to get involved, we've got Bhartidasan here with us today. Do find out more detail on that. But so far, only one vulture safe zone has been certified as being truly worthy of the name vulture safe zone, and that's in Nepal. I will let you tell more about that, John. So, getting together, there's no substitute, is there, for meeting and talking and sharing experience. And I think that has come through as one of the real positives of creating this consortium. So I do my best to sort of coordinate that consortium, but it's through the work and the reporting and feedback from all those partners. The website, do have a look at that. There's lots more information there. And I will now hand over to John to tell you why, or some of the backup to what I've been telling you from proper scientist, not like me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chris, for sharing us the importance of vulture in the ecosystem and their process of saving them. I now cordially invite our next speaker, Mr. John Mellor. He works as a senior conservation Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, RSPB, based in Sandy, UK. He has been working for the RSPB Centre for Conservation Science since 2006, working on a range of declining species. Currently, John leads the RSPB's research into Asia's vulture, providing scientific support to in-country partners in South and Southeast Asia. I now request Mr. John to take over.
Thank you very much. Good evening, and first of all, thank you for a wonderful turnout. I honestly thought I was going to come in here and there'd be 6 people, most of whom I'd spent most of the day with already. But so this is a very pleasant surprise, so thank you very much for coming along. It's a privilege to be here to share the work we've been doing on vultures in the home country of vultures. As has been said, my name's John Mallord. I work for the RSPB in the UK in their Centre for Conservation Science. And I lead the science for the RSPB, but my main job is to lend support to people in Asia who are doing all the work actually in the field. So everything I'm going to present today, please forgive me if I use the words we or I. What I mean, it's easier to say that than to list the hundreds of people who have actually been involved in the work itself. So, Chris did a great job in describing the problem, diclofenac, and what everyone, the partners in SAVE, have done to eradicate the problem and make things better. It never stops, though. That's the important thing. We carry out lots of conservation actions, but as in all other cases of conservation, it is so vitally important that we continue to monitor the effects of those conservation actions. And largely the science that has been underpinning the program, a lot of it has been to some extent just kind of monitoring the impact of the conservation actions to see if it's working. And that's vitally important in all aspects of conservation. So, as Chris detailed, diclofenac was shown in the early 2000s to be the main, if not the only, cause of the catastrophic declines in vulture populations, which led to the bans in 2006 across South Asia. But how do we know that those actions have actually worked? How can we be sure that people aren't just carrying on with their daily lives just as they were before the bans, really, and just carry on using diclofenac to treat their cows? We do that, firstly, by carrying out undercover pharmacy surveys. And this is simply a case of employing someone to go into a pharmacy, tell the pharmacist he has a sick or injured cow, and ask for a drug to treat the animal, and then to buy the first drug that is offered. The undercover part of it is really important. In fact, it's vital. Diclofenac is illegal. And so if we went in there, all guns blazing, wearing Chris's lovely Save Vulture t-shirt, I'm sure the pharmacist would get quite suspicious and not tell the truth and not say, oh, here's a vial of the illegal diclofenac, and would get a very biased view of actually what was going on in terms of availability of different drugs. So the undercover part is incredibly important. Actually, this photo from Nepal with our colleague Ishuri is a bit misleading because he's actually conducting an open pharmacy survey, in this case, talking to the pharmacist, actually explaining the issues of vulture conservation and the problems of veterinary drugs, and kind of getting a list of all the drugs that he stocks. But the results I'm going to show you are all from undercover pharmacy surveys. So it kind of gives a truer picture of the availability of different drugs that people can use on cows and other livestock. Right, so these are results that we published a few years ago from the last round of pharmacy surveys in India and Nepal and Bangladesh, but I'm afraid I won't include that here. So let's start and look at the results in Nepal. So each of these figures show the percentage of pharmacies that offer a particular drug to a surveyor. And it should be noted the different values on the y-axis. That's quite important with this graph. So if we start with diclofenac itself, so it should be first noted that the first surveys reported here were carried out in 2012. So this is 6 years after... Sorry, is this water free to drink? It is, thank you. I'm just a bit of a frog. So this is 6 years after the ban of diclofenac, and so legally we shouldn't have been offered any diclofenac whatsoever. But we were. But in Nepal, the prevalence of diclofenac in pharmacies declined very rapidly, and by the end of the surveys in 2017-18 had virtually disappeared from the whole country. And in fact, since then, these surveys have carried on, and the whole country now has been declared a diclofenac-free zone. Chris mentioned another drug, meloxicam, which is safe for vultures. And we can see that the conservation work which encourage pharmacists and livestock owners to supply and use this safe drug really did seem to work in Nepal, and throughout much of the survey period availability was at 100%, and it was only in the last couple of years that there was an apparent downturn in the percentage given, and that seems to have been mirrored by a sudden uptick in the availability of another drug, nimesulide. Now this worries us because, as I will come on to a bit later, we know that this drug is toxic to vultures. So if we now move on to India, the picture's rather messier. So if we first concentrate on diclofenac, we can see that there's a great deal of regional variation. Each of these lines refer to different states. And in some states, the use of diclofenac increased, in some it declined. But overall, by the end of the survey, it was still being given to livestock owners up to 45% of the time, even though it was an illegal drug. And this is largely due to the availability of small vials intended for human use, which is completely legal, of course, but what isn't legal is pharmacists giving it to livestock owners to treat the cows. And because diclofenac was still widely available and widely offered, meloxicam, although actually the most common drug that was provided in India, still accounted for less than 50% overall over the time period. And as in Nepal, nimesulide was widely available, although, as with others, there's a great deal of regional variation, but it's still a fairly common drug and widely used. So, I mentioned, apart from diclofenac there in the middle, there are several other drugs that are available for treating livestock, some of which are shown here. And in the last couple of slides, I've also mentioned, as did Chris during his presentation, that some drugs are toxic, some drugs are safe. So what I want to come on to now is, how do we know that? Well, in some cases, and diclofenac is a good example, nimesulide is as well, and a large number, especially diclofenac, a very large number of dead vultures were found with residues of the drug in their tissues and blood, and showing the telltale symptoms of NSAID poisoning, which is visceral gout, which is a coating of uric acid crystals on the organs, especially the liver and kidneys. And basically, the birds die of kidney failure. But visceral gout, although a telltale sign of NSAID poisoning, is not unique to NSAID poisoning. So to be able to convince governments and drug authorities to ban these drugs, we needed something else. And that something else is experimental testing of these drugs on vultures. And this is where the safety testing comes in. What is safety testing? Well, it is basically quite simple. You give a dose of a drug to vultures and basically see what happens. For the highly toxic drugs, this will unfortunately result in the death of the birds. To ameliorate some of those issues from a conservation and ethical point of view, we have tended to use either birds that are held in captivity, that are injured already and would never be released, or, as has been happening in India more recently, we've also been using Himalayan griffon vultures, which are not threatened. So we didn't feel we were pushing species closer to extinction just by carrying out our work. And the other way we've tried to ameliorate the possible side effects, really, the impacts we may have, is that we try and use the minimum number of birds. So we start small. We give 2 birds a dose of a particular drug. Sorry, there's a mouse come to see us. We give 2 birds a dose of the drug. Now, if it, like one of the highly toxic drugs, if these birds die, then that's the end of the experiment. We can stop. We know the drug is toxic and we don't have to treat any other birds. That is enough. We can publish the results based on that. They're accepted and it can be used by our conservation partners to actually advocate for bans of the drugs. If those 2 birds survive, then we scale up the process until we've given doses of the drug to up to about 45 birds. But by that time, none of the birds are dying, they're all fine and the drug is safe. We need to do far more to prove a drug is safe than to prove a drug is unsafe, statistically. And that is what is crucial when we're trying to convince people to ban drugs, for instance. So Chris highlighted this, we've been working with Bombay Natural History Society and the Indian Veterinary Research Institute to carry out these tests on a number of drugs, and the results fall into 2 camps. On the right, we have the evidence that the drugs are toxic, and these include ketoprofen, nimesulide, and aceclofenac. And what Chris didn't mention, I don't think, is that the 2 of those, ketoprofen and aceclofenac, have recently been banned by the Indian government, which is a hugely important step. And it's actually the first time since diclofenac in 2006 that that's actually happened here. So that was last year's biggest vulture conservation win. We rather hoped nimesulide would have been banned as well. It wasn't, but there are signs that that might happen in the near future rather than in the distant future. In contrast, 2 drugs have been shown to be safe. As Chris pointed out, in the early days, meloxicam was discovered to be a safe drug, and that played an important role in getting diclofenac banned in the first place, because it gave livestock owners a choice of drug to treat their cattle. So that was important. And for almost, far short of 20 years, meloxicam was the only known safe drug for vultures. Until in 2022, work by IVRI showed that another drug, tolfenamic acid, was also vulture safe. And this was great because it had different properties to meloxicam in the way it worked in cattle, and it therefore gave livestock owners yet another choice. And this is important when we're, taking away drugs by banning them. To be able to point to other effective drugs is very important. The drug at the bottom highlighted is a drug called flunixin. We suspect it's toxic because we have found, or not we, but in Europe, dead vultures have been found with visceral gout and with residues of flunixin within their tissues and blood. So we highly suspect that it is toxic, but as I said earlier, we need the experimental evidence to prove it. That is the strength of the evidence that's needed if we're convincing others to do what we want. IVRI have flunixin at the top of their list as the next drug for them to test. And as I said, actually, it's in Europe that dead birds have been found with flunixin. And one of those countries is Spain, as the wild griffon vulture. And they're actually going to undertake some safety testing of flunixin as well, because they're keen on getting these drugs banned as well, because Spain holds Europe's largest vulture populations, and they don't want to see them to go the same way as Asia's did. Right. I'm an ornithologist. I love birds and always have done. It's why I got into this job. So talking and writing about drugs and things like that doesn't really turn me on. What does is talking about birds. This is why I am interested in the work we do, the vultures themselves. So we're going to talk about a bit of work now that directly looks at the birds. But remember, in the background, the work is still there to monitor the effectiveness of the conservation actions that have been going on in the background. Although there's nothing wrong with it, this isn't just science for science sake, a pure academic exercise. There's real conservation value to the results that we find. So, why? Why do we bother? So, I haven't told you what that was all about, actually, have I? It's about GPS tagging. Tagging of birds has been one of the major technological developments in conservation and ornithology over the last few decades, and there's been an ongoing miniaturization of the technology, allowing smaller and smaller birds to have transmitters fitted to their body so we can study their movements, even study their intercontinental long-distance migrations. For big birds, this has been going on for longer because obviously they can take on heavier transmitters. And vultures have been at the forefront of this research for quite a few years, at least in Africa, Europe, and the Americas. More recently, we've started doing the work on vultures in Asia. And in Nepal, we started tagging in 2017 and have carried on ever since. So what is the benefits we can gain from tagging wild birds? What can we actually learn? So one of the things that we want to understand is how safe the environment is for vultures. This is particularly important if we're thinking about releasing birds from captive breeding populations, which we haven't really got into today because it's a whole new topic. But we want to release birds, but we can only do that when the environment is safe. And one thing you can do is actually collect samples from dead cows and analyse the samples and see what NSA drugs are actually in there. This can be logistically and otherwise challenging. And it was in Nepal. They had some logistical issues in terms of transport and storage of samples. So we've kind of gone up a step and looked at what effect it has on the birds. If there is widespread NSAIDs in the environment, then birds will die, just as they did when diclofenac was such a common drug being used. So that's the first thing we can actually learn. And we talk about dead vultures. Even at the height of the vulture crisis, when millions of birds were dying every year, actually relatively few fresh vulture carcasses were found on which post-mortems could be done to actually identify what the cause of death was. Actually, monitoring birds closely that are fitted with GPS tags means you can identify when a bird dies very quickly, and you can go and find it, retrieve it, and take it to a lab to have a post-mortem done. Following on from that, it also gives you an unbiased measure of what is actually killing the vultures. Diclofenac is a bit of a silent killer. When a vulture consumes a contaminated cow and gets a lot of diclofenac, for instance, in its system, it'll take a couple of days for the bird to die, during which time it may have flown 100 kilometres or more, and then quietly died in the middle of nowhere. The carcass will never be found. Other causes of mortality are easier to detect. We all would have heard about the sad events around the use of poison baits, where often predators are killed because livestock are being attacked, but as a collateral damage, it ends up killing dozens and dozens, sometimes hundreds of vultures. This has been a special issue in Africa, for instance. Very obvious cause of death. And you run the risk of highlighting the wrong issues by just concentrating on the most visible causes of mortality. This gives an unbiased measure. And ultimately, based on all of those things, it gives you a great unbiased method for estimating annual survival rates of the birds, which, even in the absence of dead birds and post-mortems, can give you a very strong idea of whether there's an issue or not. And we'll look at some of the results of that soon. So very briefly, as I said, we started in 2017 in Nepal, and since then we've tagged 70 wild birds. Simultaneously, we've been releasing birds from the captive breeding population and fitted tags to all of those, and that's a total of 69. And this is the first thing, the most obvious thing you can learn from tagging birds is where they go, what are their movements like. So let's just briefly have a look at these. So in blue we have the movements of the wild birds. And on the whole, they stay within around 200 kilometres of the site where they were tagged, which is denoted by the white star. It's near Chitwan National Park in the lowlands of Nepal. And both age groups, sub-adults and adult birds, tended to do the same thing, except for two birds, two wild adults that decided to be different. One of them almost made it to the Pakistan border, reaching Himachal Pradesh and Kashmir, while the other one suddenly just headed south to Maharashtra, quite close to Nagpur. Possibly didn't like it because it immediately turned around and came back again. Spent about a week at a vulture colony in Madhya Pradesh and then headed back to Nepal, ending up exactly at the same site that it took off from. In contrast, the captive release birds, and I won't go spend too much on this, haven't moved much at all. But this is important from our point of view in terms of assessing the safety of an area. And that's why it's important to tag the wild birds, because they travel over such large areas. They tell us how safe a far larger area is, and that's important in the long term, whether we're releasing birds or not, to know that basically our conservation actions are working or not. As I said, being able to estimate annual survival rates is really valuable. Vultures are big birds, and like all big birds, they tend to live a long time. And here we have some examples of that, of related gyps vultures from elsewhere in the world. Eurasian griffon vultures in Europe and African whiteback vultures in South Africa. And we can see survival rates when there are no problems are very high, all over 95% annual survival for adults. And even juveniles, or young birds, which never survive as long as adults, all bird species, even then, their survival rates are up to 85% or more. So how do our tagged white-rump vultures compare? Well, actually very favourably indeed. The adults have a survival rate of 97% annually, and the sub-adults, here it suggests it's 88%. More recent analysis of the same data suggests it could be as high as 90%. So this is further evidence that the conservation actions taken in Nepal have been effective. This should be seen in the context that 20 years ago, this would have shown 50% annual mortality, annual survival. It would have virtually been half of what it is. So it's very suggestive that the conservation actions that have been taken to get rid of diclofenac have worked. And of course, a more direct way of discovering that is to, find the dead birds, as we've spoken about, and see what has actually killed them. And although survival rates have been very high, of course, birds die, and they have, and they've died from lots of different reasons. Starvation and basically being weak has actually been quite an issue for the release birds. And this is something, as I said, we're not really going to talk about the captive breeding program and the releases, but it is something we need to consider with future breeding programs and releases of vultures. Other causes of mortality have involved what we call emerging threats. Globally, the most serious threats to vultures are the use of poison baits and electrocution. And indeed, we have lost 4 birds to electrocution on domestic power distribution lines, and all 4 of these have been the release birds. And I think that's important because they're going to be more naive and may not be familiar with what goes on a power line. And our colleagues in Nepal are currently undertaking surveys to see if they can, how many birds they can find, and they've carried out hundreds of kilometres worth of surveys and have not found one white-rump vulture, which is great. But they have found a number of Himalayan vultures, which are a lot bigger birds, and so we can't be complacent, and this could be an issue for this species more than others. And sadly, there are been a few poison bait incidents in Nepal as well. It seems to be something happening more recently. I should be doing this. That's a weak bird. I should say that when we've retrieved these weak birds, half of them actually survived and actually responded to treatment, and we released them again, and at least one of them has gone on to nest successfully, so that's a positive of the release program. An electrocution of one of our tag birds. And poisoning. This one happened in 2021. 3 dogs were laced with poison by villagers who were fed up with their goats being attacked. Sadly, it ended up killing 69 vultures. In the last year or two, there have been more incidents near to our centre of vulture work, and has killed other tag birds as well. So there's still things that we need to consider. But from what I've been talking about all along, what's most important is what's not on the table, and that is there's been no evidence that any birds have died of NSA poisoning. And that is really positive, and I think explains why survival is so high. Sorry? Well, there were two incidences. There were two incidents of persecution. One was children killing a bird with a catapult, and the other one was a bird that seems to have just been clubbed by a local person, breaking its wing and damaging its head. Don't understand why. But again, it's something that's more likely to happen with these released birds. They might be weaker because they're not used to flying. They also might be more tolerant of close approach by humans as well, because they have been in captivity. So we think it's as much their naivety that's perhaps causing these issues. Ultimately, the goal of all conservation actions is to see a positive effect of your conservation and positive trends in your target and populations of your target species. You need to monitor the populations. And for vultures in Nepal and in India, this has been done through the use of road transect surveys. In India, this has involved driving over 16,000 kilometres throughout north and central India, standing on the back of a pickup truck, counting birds, vultures and other scavengers that you see along the way. So you saw this result in Chris's talk. This is the population trajectory of Nepal's white-rumped vultures. We can see that there was big declines, obviously. Even after 2006, when diclofenac was banned, the declines continued, probably because of continued illegal use of diclofenac. And then it got to around 2013, which coincidentally was when there were nationwide rollouts of the conservation actions across Nepal. And since then, there has been a dramatic upturn in the fortunes of vultures. They are actually increasing at as fast a rate that is actually possible for a bird the size of a vulture that only has one chick a year could possibly do. And it's largely down to what we've seen before, the incredibly high survival rates. So that is really positive. And as Chris said, it's the light in the dark of our worst nightmares. It's what we hang on to when we carry on working, that it can be done, that the conservation actions that we do can work. What about India? Well, similar picture, obviously, in the early years. These started a lot earlier, in 1992, when vultures were incredibly common. And as Chris pointed out, the logarithmic scale that for the white-rumped vultures, the circles, this is a 99.9% decline. One where there were 1,000 birds, there was one left by 2007, which is just after the ban. So what's happened since? Well, not a lot, which is actually good news. By 2006, with the trajectory of the populations as it was highly likely that these species would have gone extinct within a few years, losing 50% of their birds every year. So the fact that since the ban on diclofenac, the populations have remained stable is hugely positive. Unlike Nepal, though, there's been no sign of an upturn in the vultures' fortunes. They aren't increasing in the same way. Why the difference? Well, perhaps we can just go back to those early graphs I showed from the undercover pharmacy surveys and the fact that diclofenac is still a more prevalent drug, even though it's illegal, whereas it's disappeared in Nepal. So just to finish off, just what can we conclude from all about the safety of the environment, what birds do, what's killing them, etc., etc. We've had a great program in Nepal. We need to get wide-scale tagging done elsewhere, and especially in India, but up to now it's proved a little difficult to get done. That needs to be the next step. And the basics matter. We need to know the status of vulture populations. That is the only way we can understand whether what we're doing is working or not. We need to monitor vulture populations and continue with the road transect surveys and keep going, because it's not alarmist to still talk about the imminent extinction of vultures in Asia. If we don't do the pharmacy surveys, we might miss the appearance of the next diclofenac, which then causes untold misery to millions, well, not millions of vultures, because there aren't millions of vultures, just the thousands left. And if that happens, well, it won't take long for extinction to happen. And if we're not monitoring the fate of the GPS-tagged birds, we won't notice that in a given year, half of them die. So it's important that we really do continue with the work that we are doing, because then vultures are not out of the woods just yet. Anyway, thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Mr. John, for sharing us on the importance of drought and the effect on vultures. I warmly invite Mr. Saravanan Chandrasekharan, Assistant Vice President, Kumaraguru Institutions, for the oath of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Chris and John, for being here and helping all of us understand more about vultures and the status right now and the conservation efforts being done by SAVE and its partners, consortium partners across the world. And I'm sure all of us will be grateful for the efforts being taken by fantastic conservationists and scientists in protecting the ecological diversity of our region. Chris and John, and we have Mr. Bharatidas in here from Arulagam, who has been pioneering vulture conservation in our region. So thanks to all of them, and also we have Dr. Murali, who has a vast experience with working on ornithology and birds. So all their contributions are so significant for us and the biodiversity which gives us, which we all of us depend on. Thank you so much, and thanks for all the enthusiastic participants who came in curiously after your hours. I mean, that's an intention that which we had. We thought we should do it post our working time, so that we get excited students come and listen to such fantastic talk. I'm sure their presentation will inspire you to think about conservation and take up some initiatives. And on behalf of Kumaraguru Institution, we are sure that we will be part of Arulagam and SAVE's efforts in whatever way possible, to contribute to vulture conservation in the best way possible in our region. Thank you so much. Now I would like to call Mr. Natarajan and Dr. Murali to felicitate both John and Chris with a memento. Yeah.
The memento embodies tradition, the most durable hand-woven, the Bhavani Jamakalam, a tribute to the hard work of farmers and weavers. Tanjore dancing dolls, traditionally known as Tanjavur Talayati Bommai, are part of an eclectic heritage of beautiful handicrafts from Tanjore.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much for participating. See you all in the next gathering with another fantastic session soon. Thank you so much.